Kick things off.
Can everyone online hear the room?
I can hear.
I think let's rock and roll and maybe skip introductions today.
Skip intro.
Do you think that's okay?
Yeah, I mean,
I'm just worried about,
we're tight on time.
I'm worried about a tight time and I want to preference having conversations, so.
Okay, great. Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the April 16th meeting of the Nitrogen Management Consortium. As Maya said, we have a pretty tight agenda for today, so we're going to go ahead and skip introductions and just go ahead and get started with the biennial seagrass mapping results update with Chris. Chris, welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I will be brief because I know we have a poll agenda. I promise I will be quick. All right, so yeah, good morning, everyone. Chris Anastasio, I'm the Chief Water Quality Scientist and Seagrass Mapping Program Lead for the Southwest Florida Water Management District. So today I'm just going to basically go over the seagrass mapping results from our 2024 cycle. I'm going to focus on Tampa Bay, although I'll show you some of the other numbers as well. We've been mapping since 1988, as many of you know. We map on a 2-year cycle, so 2024, and then the next cycle will be 2026. We also do the Springs Coast region, which is that area from Anclote North, and that area we do on a 4-year cycle. So this was the year that we did this area as well, and the next one will be in 2028. It's a continuous process, and we do coordinate with other districts. So St. Johns River Water Management District's been doing very similar mapping in the Indian River Lagoon since like the mid 80s. And then South Florida also does mapping based on aerial photography, not as consistent as us in St. John's, but they do Caloosahatchee, Estero Bay region. There's basically 3 elements to this, and the only reason why I want to bring this up is just, well, for a couple of things. One, so that y'all understand what these numbers really mean. So, you know, we base our mapping on aerial imagery, digital imagery, high resolution. In this area, 6-inch pixel resolution, which means every pixel on the screen represents about 6 inches in real space. The thing that you got to keep in mind too is we collect this imagery during the winter. So we call this a 2024 map, but it was based on imagery collected between December of 23, actually April of 24. So last year at this time is what these numbers represent. Why is that important? Because it does not speak to the impacts, if any, of the hurricanes from last year. So just keep that in mind. This is a winter 2024 map. And again, it's based on the interpretation of the signature from these images, and we offset that with a fair amount of field work. So how we do this is we basically use a modified Florida land use land cover classification system. We map more than just seagrass, although it is a seagrass map, and we focus on that. So that's what we'll be talking about today. And I'll go into this in a little bit. So there's 2 codes that you'll see. If you download our shapefiles, you'll see a 9116 and a 9113. 9116 is a signature that you see on the right as an example, where you have 25 to 100% cover based on that aerial image signature. The video on the left kind of gives you an idea of what that might look like in real space. The other seagrass code is what we call patchy or sparse. Those terms can basically be used interchangeably. And this is when that signature shows a 10 to 25% cover. And again, this can be either these little patches that you see on that image, or it can just be a sparse area, which is typically characterized by very light green hues. There is a third one I want to highlight, and this is going to be important for certain segments in Tampa Bay, which is attached macroalgae. So we do not, by definition, map drift algae because it drifts, but we do try to map attached macroalgae in areas where we expect to see seagrass. So this is not a macroalgae map. So when I'll be showing you some numbers for this particular code, that does not imply that that's all the macroalgae in a particular Bay segment. It's just in the areas that we mapped for seagrass. So that's just something to keep in mind. And when we talk about attached macroalgae in Tampa Bay, typically we're talking about things like Caulerpa prolifera, which is what you see on the left-hand side for the most part. Might be Ceratoroides in there too. Okay, so what I'm going to show you after this is the actual numbers. And just remember, it's based on the sum of the continuous or dense class and the patchy or sparse class. And then just again, to reiterate, we don't map drift algae because they drift, but we do record that in the field data and in the videos that we collect for the field data. The other thing just to keep in mind is these maps don't represent the species composition or the condition of the grass, just the image signature of that grass. So it's a spatial map, landscape scale. All right, that was pretty quick, right? Okay, awesome. So let's go into the results. So what we typically do is, so there's two goals in our mapping program that we do at the district. One is, what is the actual total acreage estimated based on aerial photography? The other is, what's the change? And that's perhaps even the more important element of our maps, is how are we trending? Are we trending up, down, no trend at all? And so what we typically do and what we provide in our shapefiles is a change map. And we look at the year prior and then the current year. So in this case, it would be 2022 versus 2024. And we'll do that for the estuaries, and we call them the Suncoast estuaries, which goes from St. Joseph Sound down to Charlotte Harbor. So these are the numbers. Not too bad overall. But as you can see, the further south you go, the more negative the numbers get until you get down to Charlotte Harbor, where we did map about a 6% loss between 22 and 24. Tampa Bay, about a 5% gain. So overall, that's good news. It's the first time Tampa Bay's seen a gain since 2018, 2016. It's been a while. So we'll take that any day. And of course, Sarasota Bay did see the largest amount of gain, both from a percent change and a total acreage of about 1,900 acres between those two mapping cycles. So let's go straight to Tampa Bay. This is what the map looked like in 2022. So 2 years ago, I stood here and you guys were booing me because 12% loss, not great. Just to remind you, the colors on the map, 9113 is sparse, 9116 is continuous or dense, and then 9121 is that attached algae. And of course, you can see where much of that attached algae was mapped was in Old Tampa Bay. So here we are today. Still got a lot of attached algae in Old Tampa Bay. We'll look at that here in a second. But overall, 5% gain, about 1,400 acres increase between 2022 and 2024 Bay-wide. But there's a lot of information embedded within these maps too, and I want to drill down a little bit with some of these Bay segments. The one that probably catches your eye is Hillsborough Bay with 185% gain. That is not a typo, about 756 acres. Now, I don't remember if that one's next or Old Tampa Bay is next, but we'll get to it. The other thing I just wanted to highlight is the graph on the bottom left is showing you total, the patchy, and the continuous. And the reason why we want to break that out is because we can glean some information on the quality of these beds based on whether or not it's continuous, whether or not it's patchy, and the trends intrinsic within each of those. So if you're getting more continuous beds, that means that these grass beds are becoming potentially more resilient. They're filling in, they're more dense. Or if you're getting more patchy at the expense of continuous, then it could indicate that you're seeing some destabilization of these seagrass meadows. So there's a lot of information embedded within these maps, and I just wanted to highlight that. Of course, the change map on the right, green is gain, red is loss, kind of scattered around throughout. There's a couple of large patches of green that I want to highlight, and we'll do that here in a second. All right, so we'll go to Old Tampa Bay first. We'll get the bad news done first, and then we'll look at some of the good news. 8% loss overall in Old Tampa Bay. Big changes since 2016. Lots of attached algae, as you can see, although not as much as in previous cycles, which we'll see in a second. This is the change. So again, some of the change The loss that we see is really in the upper portion of Old Tampa Bay above Courtney Campbell, probably not much of a surprise. Some of the losses along the Howard Franklin associated with the expansion of the bridge. But there's a couple of things I wanted to highlight here that are gains. And one of the areas I wanted to highlight is right over here. It looks kind of like a weird looking face. This is the tip of Feather Sound, what we call the hump. That's potentially good news because what it indicates is that there are grasses that are starting to come back. Remember, we're basing our maps on imagery that was collected around 9,000 feet. So if you've got a couple of shoots of haliduli here and there, we may not see it from the imagery. But what this suggests is that there is grass that is starting to try at least to come back. And that's verified too with field work. It's verified with working with the estuary program that we think that's a real gain, which is good news. The other good news is up here in the northeastern part of Old Tampa Bay, right around where the DOT made the cut in the Courtney Campbell Causeway, we saw some gains. We saw about 80 acres of gain in this area, which is also good news because that was one of the areas where we lost a lot of grass between 2018 and 2020. So again, could be the beginning of a partial recovery, at least. I don't want to speculate, but that's some encouraging information in the midst of what you see is a lot of red. Okay, and then I just wanted to focus on the attached algae because Old Tampa Bay has a lot of chlorpa in it, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. In 2018, we didn't map any attached algae, any chlorpa. That doesn't mean it wasn't there. It just means that the dominant signature was grass. Well, that flipped in 2020 where we started to see a real explosion in that dominant signature of attached algae or chlorpa. So much so that you can see that we gained about 4,000 acres of attached algae and we lost a significant amount of seagrass. 2022, we started seeing a slight decline, and that downward trend has continued with respect to the attached algae. There's still tons of it out there, but it's not as much as it was in 2020. And so again, we think perhaps, all other things being equal, that we might start to see a bit of a shift back towards seagrass as long as we can continue to see a downward trend in attached algae. Drift algae is a big concern. And again, we don't map that by convention. So that is always a concern. And that's a concern not just in Old Tampa Bay, that's everywhere. All right, let's move over to Hillsborough Bay. So Hillsborough Bay saw this big 185% gain. This is following some pretty historic losses, again, similar to Old Tampa Bay from about 2016 to 2022. This is the actual map. So this is where the grasses were mapped. Again, light green is sparse or patchy, dark green is continuous. Not a big surprise. There's never really much continuous grass in Hillsborough Bay. Most of it is patchy, haliduli, some halophila. But if we see where the change occurred, almost all the loss that we saw in between 2016 to 2022 was located mostly on the eastern side of Hillsborough Bay, and that's where we saw some of the gain. One thing I want to point out here, and this is not just exclusive to Hillsborough Bay. You notice that those red polygons on the very shallowest side of Hillsborough Bay, right along here. This is a phenomenon we're seeing in other, not only bay segments, but other estuaries. And it got us thinking about why we might be seeing losses in those very shallow areas. So these are areas that typically will be exposed at low tide. And so that got us thinking about some of the discussions we've had about impacts of temperature and maybe even UV. So it's just something as an aside to keep an eye on, because this is really the first cycle that I've seen a pronounced loss along that interface between the tidal flat and the mangrove fringe. The shallow edge. Yes, we always talk about the deep edge as being the big issue. Light, light limitation, deep edge. Well, let us not forget the shallow edge too is potentially quite a hostile environment for seagrass. And then I wanted to just move south to lower Tampa Bay because lower Tampa Bay, we often focus on Old Tampa Bay, Hillsborough Bay, because those are the areas that we tend to see losses. We tend to see, less than ideal conditions. But, and Ed, I know you've pointed this out in the past too, like we can't forget those segments that are actually doing well. And lower Tampa Bay is is definitely doing well. In fact, we mapped a record high seagrass acreage this year, as you can see by the graphic on the left. The other thing too, again, by parsing out continuous and patchy, because that dark green line is greater than the light green line, which is what you want to see, that means most of these beds they're dense, and so they're more resilient perhaps to change than if you have more of these ephemeral haliduli beds, which is typically characterized by that patchy or sparse classification. Something that really stands out, and we did confirm this is real, is that large area of gain that we saw on the south and west end of the Skyway Bridge. So that has driven a lot of the increases that we've seen. And again, a lot of that increase is in the patchy or sparse, but we're still seeing a fair amount of continuous seagrass in this area as well. And then just real quick, I just wanted to show you what the trends look like in the other bay segments. Middle Tampa Bay, Manatee River, Terracea, and Boca Ciega Bay, all trending either no change or slight increase. We've seen some increases in Boca Ciega Bay near record highs, still about 60 acres or so short of the record that was in 2018. But again, mostly continuous grass, which is what we want to see. But to Maya's point, this doesn't mean it's all grass. There's a lot of macroalgae out there, as many of you know. So, I don't want you to think that it's, all just clean grass. There is quite a bit of macroalgae, but the bottom line is that most of these bay segments seem to be doing well, despite the fact that we have a fair amount of macroalgae out there. All right, so bay-wide, about 5% gain. All the bay segments except for Old Tampa Bay either saw no change or a slight increase, which is good news. And then, we always like to look at things in historical context. We've had some issues. We've had a lot of loss over the last several years, but we're still about 36% more seagrass today than we were in 1988, which is good news. And of course, it does appear that the lower segments, especially lower Tampa Bay, Boca Ciega Bay, are doing really well. Old Tampa Bay continues to be our problem child. And then just as as kind of a wider view, I compared the 1988 estimates with the most recent ones for all the estuaries that we map in the Suncoast, just to kind of give you a larger regional perspective. That negative 23% in Charlotte Harbor, most of that occurred again between like 2016 and 2024. But Tampa Bay is looking good, Sarasota Bay, both still well above where they were back in 1988. So that's it. I did want to just highlight again, if you haven't visited our seagrass mapping tool, it only goes to 2022. We haven't updated it yet, but this is a tool that you can allows you to look at 2 years goes back to 99. We haven't gone back to 88 yet, but from 1999 to 2022, soon to be 24. You can compare 2 years, not only the maps themselves, but also the imagery, and it does some calculations. So if you haven't been on that, I encourage you to check it out. And if you have any feedback, to please let me know, because we're constantly trying to make improvements with this tool. Again, thanks to all our partners. This is by no means an all-inclusive list. And the shapefiles will be available very soon. This week, we're finalizing some of the quality control. So they should be on our website here within the next couple of weeks. And then we will be adding that 24 layer to the map viewer. We do have the Springs Coast coming out. We're finalizing those maps. Those should be out next week, next month. And then, yeah, we're starting the 26 cycle. So we'll be flying December of this year to collect those. And so we'll see what happens. That's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Any questions for Chris? Okay, we'll beat you up when it's bad and
Yeah, I know.
when it's good. But thank you, Chris. All right, so moving on in the agenda, we are going to get an update from Sharon with Stantec on task 3 of the Old Tampa Bay Assembly Capacity Assessment, specifically the CASCM updates and draft nutrient management strategy.
Good morning, everyone. All right. So today I'm here to share with you some of the results that we've put together as a follow-up from task 2. And this is work that we're doing via the Comprehensive Aquatic Systems Model to help provide a new line of evidence and support the findings that we've done in task 2. And yeah. Okay. So for this morning, following from Chris's talk, we're going to be focusing on Old Tampa Bay and talking a little bit more in detail about various aspects of work that we've done. First, I'd like to provide some background and framework on what it is that we've done over the last year, and then follow up with providing the task 2 recommended management interventions, and then go on to the model. Discuss what the ongoing and proposed interventions are, summarize those interventions that we have looked into detail on, and then provide sort of a path forward for the next steps. So as part of task 1 last year, we updated the nutrient management paradigm. And basically what we did was to focus on the nitrogen loading and reducing chlorophyll piece, and added a view and shone the light on trying to get more resolution by looking at seasonal and subsegment targets. And all that was in goal of helping reduce the pyridinium. And ultimately the goal was to improve water quality and increase seagrass cover. So in task 2, we focused on the nitrogen and the chlorophyll. And there was a line of evidence that was provided in task 2 report. And in task 3 here, we are following up with using the aquatic systems model, the CHASM model. This CHASM model was developed by Dr. Steve Bartel, who is on the line here, to answer any technical questions you may have. So my understanding is that this model is a very complex ecosystem model. It has about 30 biological inputs, looking at different species, different components of the community, and the interactions, predator-prey interactions, sediment diagenesis, nutrient fluxes, and there in that model are at least 10 different environmental parameters. It generates a whole series of outputs, ranging from biological to environmental to also ecological risk. The focus for the work that we did is primarily on nitrogen, and looking at how nitrogen can impact chlorophyll concentrations as well as overall nitrogen loading. So the interventions that were identified in task 2 were then followed up here in this work that we're doing. And the 3 interventions that we looked at were holding the line at 486 tons a year, looking at reducing lake tarpon flow to minimize the flashy seasonal flows and keeping it at 40 CFS, and then doing oyster restoration at 175 acres and seeing what would happen. All 3 interventions were modeled using CHASM, and the purpose of this task was to generate another separate line of evidence to see what could be done to improve Old Tampa Bay, and secondarily to see if those interventions are achievable. So just a bit of what we covered in task 2. Why do we want to manage nitrogen? And why should we manage it to 486 tons a year? Well, there are years where the absolute load of nitrogen exceeds the TMDL. There. And as you can see, the blue line here is above the dotted line, but the normalized loads stay below. And these exceedances are due to the high volume of water going into Old Tampa Bay, and that normalized load is masked because the nitrogen is diluted. So there is a lot of nitrogen going in there, but we're not capturing it in the metrics. So the primary management intervention we're proposing is to manage the load to 486 tons a year of absolute loading. So in this next series of slides, you'll see several of these slides will have this paradigm here to the top right, and I'll highlight the areas that we're going to be looking at. And then it will also have a graph at the bottom where we have projected and modeled out old Tampa Bay dynamics up to 2041. So we've put in a future scenario in here, and the y-axis is going to be chlorophyll. So the data for the most part are consistent with showing you chlorophyll changes over time with the regulatory threshold being demarcated being demarcated in gray, and then the management target in the dotted line. What you're seeing here is the observed annual TN loading and the projected modeled under baseline conditions for 2012 to 2041. So what does the model show? The model showed that the chasm customized to old Tampa Bay dynamics was a good fit compared to the other model simulations that had been done in years past. These model runs were calibrated using 10 years of data from 2012 to 2021, and the chasm tracks the observed results, although it generally underpredicts the chlorophyll concentrations. And I can get into that, or Steve and I can get into that separately with you all if you desire at the end of the conversation or at a different time. But the key point, is that keeping the TN load to 486 tons a year, as is shown by the blue line here, helps improve water quality in old Tampa Bay. So the reductions that we primarily observe are in the western part of old Tampa Bay, as well as in the northeast section. And the reductions that we see are primarily in the summer months when chlorophyll concentrations are the highest. All right, so then in terms of managing the loads and reducing nitrogen loads, let's talk a little bit more about the reductions. The reductions result in an average of about 17% decrease in chlorophyll A concentrations. And even though this orange line is lower than the green line here, the green line is fairly close to the regulatory threshold. So even if this line were to go up a little bit, by having it be more consistent and reduced up to 17% on average, you will, for the most part, you will have an increased probability of meeting the management thresholds. That's a good thing to do. Moving on, looking at reducing lake tarpon inputs. Right, so trying to reduce lake tarpon inputs, we have the orange baseline again, and then we have the green line, which is the lake tarpon constrained flows. And when you reduce the lake tarpon inflows to 40 CFS, it reduces the chlorophyll A by about 12% and on average. And once again, this will help improve the probability of meeting the management threshold. Where is this impact occurring? It's occurring primarily in the northwest section. So you're seeing it in that subsegment, and over time it will disperse out to the other subsegments, but for the initial input, you see it primarily in that northwest subsegment. All right, then moving on to oyster restoration. Oyster restoration is meant to reduce pyridinium concentrations to some degree, and the increase of oyster coverage to 175 acres appears to reduce chlorophyll for most of the years modeled. What you do see, however, is that towards the tail end of the modeling period, you end up having higher chlorophyll concentrations. And this may be a function of the oyster excretion and the sediment diagenesis being unable to absorb that nitrogen. And so what you end up having is sediment nitrogen coming out into the water column. And consequently, that results in higher chlorophyll concentrations over time in the last 6 years. Where is the chlorophyll reduction occurring? It's primarily in the western and the northeast sections. It is also notable that for this chlorophyll modeling effort, we did notice a lag. There was a lag of about 5 or 6 years before the impact of the oysters was felt. And then towards the tail end, then you would see this increase in chlorophyll concentrations. So the chlorophyll impact of oysters varies over time. So overall, oyster coverage and restoration efforts appears to improve water quality, although this could become a nutrient source. And so the recommendation is that once you've got oysters in the system for a while, potentially what you might want to consider is to remove the oysters on a regular basis to preclude getting to that level or move them around perhaps.
They modeled this based off of like oyster restoration like we do today. They didn't model it based off of like oyster aquaculture restoration techniques where you're taking things in cages off bottom.
Natural restoration efforts.
Okay.
So, okay.
Can you repeat what was said from the audience, guys? I couldn't hear that. I apologize.
Yeah, sorry, Jeff. What was said was just clarifying that what they modeled in the chasm model was oyster restoration, sort of as we see it now in, on the bottom. And then the oyster reefs, the oysters are forming reefs or they're on domes, things like that. So they modeled sort of like natural oyster restoration techniques. They did not model, aquaculture restoration techniques, like where you're growing oysters off bottom in bags where you could harvest them and take them out of the system over time. And that would have an impact on the effectiveness of chlorophyll A reductions over time, which the way that they're modeling it basically shows that like the oysters will switch from being a source of nitrogen that might exacerbate chlorophyll.
That would address one of my concerns with relying on that. Thank you.
All right, so the next thing we did was to compile all 3 interventions to see what would happen. And on the graph here, you see the green line, which is the observed, the orange, which is the baseline, and then the blue, which is all 3 interventions combined with a standard deviation around each annualized value. And what this shows is that the interventions appear to be fairly effective at reducing chlorophyll concentrations in Old Tampa Bay, and it would meet compliance consistently if all interventions were implemented. So it would result in the lowest chlorophyll conditions. And so we are proposing that to remain the primary intervention that moves forward. All right, so going from the modeling and all the way up to 2041, the next question was, what is going on now? What's going on in the bay now? What are the existing interventions? And can we get to 486 tons per year with existing interventions? What we did was we went into the MS4 permits and looked at all the different activities that were being conducted by the different entities. And we compiled them and defined and created a table with an anticipated nitrogen load offset for each one of the different subsegments of Old Tampa Bay. We assume that street sweeping activities and all other investments are going to continue over time. So we're using these numbers and moving forward into the future. We're still waiting on a couple of entities for feedback, so those numbers may increase over time. Similarly, we also looked at domestic point source reductions, and we went into the SB 64 implementation plans and looked at all the different proposed activities that were in the books and created an anticipated nitrogen load offset, corrected for reuse and deep injection for the regions of Old Tampa Bay as well. And put all that in a table, and what we see is that the compiled reduction today is approximately 41.67 tons in 2032. Currently, it's 5.3 tons on as it stands right now at the end of last year. The average RA loading exceedance relative to the absolute load for 2012 and 2021 was 84 tons a year, with approximately 41.7 tons to that effect. To pull that number down, we are about halfway there. So we are still short about 50% or 42.3 tons in order to make up that shortfall. So can we achieve that 84 tons? Well, it's a stretch, but I think it's achievable. So what we have here on the graph, now I've switched over to TN loading, not chlorophyll anymore. And I've mapped it out here for what is projected versus what the projects are going to do to bring down TN loads. And I put in the MS4 and SB64 projects starting in 2032. Right now is only the MS4 of 5 and change in this first half up to 2032. So that is about 1 to 10% of the total annual load, depending on year. But wait, when you add in Lake Tarpon, you can reduce the inputs by a significant amount. You reduce it by another 47.8 tons more if you hold the flow at 40 CFS. And you actually see it is a notable drop in the years after 2032. So what does this all mean? The CHASM tool is a reliable tool to model chlorophyll A dynamics in Old Tampa Bay. It can also model nitrogen dynamics. Reducing nitrogen inputs to 486 will increase the likelihood of meeting the chlorophyll numeric nutrient criteria threshold. There are multiple pathways to get there, and our suggestions are that we need to add in a few more projects. The SB64 and MS4 projects will take us there, but we also may need to do a Lake Tarpon intervention. And so if you do that, you couple it with oyster restoration, we would have a good chance of getting Old Tampa Bay nitrogen loading reduced. And that, in a nutshell, is it. Thank you. Any questions?
I have
Chris.
a question. So I'd like to go back to that model, the baseline versus the actual. That's quite a discrepancy. And I'm just curious, like that, to me, have you looked at the skill of this model? And you mentioned that it's compared to some of the other models, the WASP model. I'm curious, like how far off were those models compared to the CHASM model? Because that to me is not a good fit.
Yeah.
These are annualized numbers, and similarly, the other models do underpredict chlorophyll conditions as well. When you look at the monthly observation, it looks much closer.
Can y'all speak up other than Chris? I heard Chris, but I'm not hearing the response.
Sorry, Jeff.
This is Ed. I was
Okay.
just stating, these are annualized numbers, so a lot of the results from the other models, when we look at on an annual basis, are also under predicting chlorophyll. I
Okay,
think one of the true comparisons that we've used is some goodness of fit metrics. So when you look at goodness of fit of the old Tampa Bay ecosystem, integrated ecosystem model and the WASP box model that Gerald has been developing, what's being produced by Chasm is comparable in terms of goodness of fit metrics on these annualized measures. When you look at the monthly values, it's much closer to showing the peaks. The improvements of this Chasm modeling framework is that it integrates other ecosystem metrics, including phytoplankton, macroalgae, seagrass that we haven't dug into yet. And it also has shown improvements in terms of using growth parameters related specifically to pyridinium. So there's been some incremental progress in the models, but as we know, all models.
It's the best available.
So, and that was a concern to us as well, those under predictions. I think what we were trying to get past is that these are all forecasts in the future. This is, looking ahead to 2041. We don't know what the reality of 2041 is going to look like. We used existing trends of loading, temperature, and other hydrologic conditions to input into this model to kind of simulate what the effect would be on chlorophyll using these different management interventions. So this is the only model available where we can do that. And that's why we've applied in this situation with all the caveats that I just mentioned in terms of the trends versus the observed conditions.
okay.
Yeah.
I do have a question at some point, but I'll let y'all work through the audience. I apologize for not being present.
So one other point to make too is even though it is an under prediction, as Ed said, most of the models that we've used have shown that the patterns are similar if you look at the observed to the modeled. So when observed goes down, the model goes down. When observed goes up, the model goes up. So that to me doesn't preclude this as a useful tool for modeling the potential interventions. It's going to show how a system is likely to respond, just not the potential magnitude that they would expect. So you can say like, oh, well, it's going to go down with oysters or it's going to go down with reduction of like tarpon. So I see that as still being a valuable asset.
I agree. Yeah, I just think we need to be careful how we assess the effectiveness of these interventions, because from a pattern standpoint, 100%, I agree. I think we can definitely need some of that information, but I think we need to be careful if we're going to start managing to a target, because now you're talking absolute values. Right. So that was just kind of the only thing that stood out. The other thing that I found interesting about this curve is it looks like when you go all the way out to 2040, what is that, 2? There's a bit of a predicted rise almost to the point where we get back to getting close to or above the target. I'm wondering what's causing that? Oysters. Oh, okay. So that's why when you were saying about you need to harvest them, that could offset that.
Right.
The feedback of increased oyster biomass into set point.
So what this suggests is if a tool that we move forward with is an oyster restoration target, probably also will want to be really specific about how we want to accomplish that.
Yeah.
So perhaps it's natural, perhaps it's a restoration aquaculture technique. We might need to be dialing things in that level of specificity if that is a key part of the strategy going forward. But I think the primary recommendation that's been put before us as a group is this idea of, do we change the way we assess compliance based on an absolute load? And if so, that's going to have implications, as we've discussed, for everyone's permits and the kinds of projects that you might need to do. The extent to which you need to invest in additional projects, you might be able to mitigate it slightly if you do some of these complementary interventions. But what we've shown through the CASA model is none of these complementary measures, like drinking water from Lake Tarpon or installing oysters, none of those things on their own are going to produce the kinds of results that you all have said as a collective that you're looking for in the old Tampa Bay segment. So that's the gist of what the modeling effort, it's, you know, it's better, it's best available, but not perfect information. But that's sort of like the information we could provide that you can make a decision off of, or, you know, say that you're not, you can decide whether or not you want to.
Make one more point on the oysters as well. Those were, we looked at that very, I guess, initially, that was based on the oyster suitability areas. So as Brian pointed out, that what was modeled was based on a restoration rather than an aquaculture type scenario. And that, you know, we're cognizant of that oyster harvesting for consumption is not currently permitted, but it was in the past in Old Tampa Bay, and that, you know, can be added to stretch goals, you know, the idea of bringing the water quality back. But the more of the location of those oyster restoration, that was based on that habitat suitability, which those do overlap with some seagrass areas. So you do have some competing resource efforts there. So there, like all of this, as you all know, the refinement of some of these interventions, you know, in the model, you can continue to apply that and look at some of those details. When you get out to that last 6 years and you're looking at that biomass from the oysters and the nutrient input from that, that's where, you know, you can dig into that a little bit more specific on location, habitat. And also to mention, as we all know, that oyster restoration has value beyond its filtering ability and the habitat components and the complementary targets that the estuary program has as well.
Jeff, what was your question?
Oh, well, my question is probably one that no one will like. When I look at figure 3.4 in the task 2 report, I find it difficult to accept that 486 is low enough. The confidence interval that you guys show, I believe at best has a 70% success rate, and I think the median's in the low 60s. It would be hard for me to go to my leadership and say, I'm going to invest tens of millions of dollars in a regional stormwater control system. And oh yeah, by the way, I got about a 62% success rate. Now maybe coming back to you in another 10 years saying, or 5 years, and I've got to do this again. I think the other question I have for everybody is that's a component of that, or a springboard of that, is we're going to open up 2 final orders and expose everybody in the Bay to challenge. And we're going to try to change the DEP rule on the basis of a 62% success rate. So I'm really struggling with being able to support that. I'm not saying that the hydrologic normalization works. We know that that doesn't work. I don't really need to look at that. I won't go into the past. I just don't want to open both final orders, which you have to do to make this correction. And you have to get DEP concurrence to open up 302 and make that change on the numeric nutrient criteria. And we're going to expose everybody. And oh, by the way, you're going to put every MS4 out of compliance to some point in the future. And how is DEP going to respond to that?
I heard 2 issues from you, Jeff. Let me get people's reaction in the room to the first one. So the first point that Jeff is asking of you all to kind of weigh in on is he thinks that 486 tons of nitrogen per year is not a low enough threshold. So he is saying, what do folks think about going to a number that is less than 486 tons per year of total nitrogen to Old Tampa Bay? Can I get the room to weigh in on how they feel about that?
And that's based on that figure, I think 3.4
Yeah.
A or B, I can't remember. There's 2 of them that show that if we go to a strict 486 tons, our confidence interval is that we're only going to be successful 62% of the time, or something to that effect, low 60s. I mean, it wasn't desperate. The figure wasn't set up so I could actually read the number. So I'm just saying it's hard for me to ask my leadership to I don't have a problem saying, yeah, the right number is 400. If we can demonstrate that through science and saying, yeah, I got to get us to this number. I need to do regional stormwater. But in the absence of that, I'm going to go to leadership and say, yeah,
Jeff,
all right.
I hear you. Do me a solid. Let's let other folks in the room weigh in on what you're proposing, because it's a really important point to hear from others as well. I think you've made a valid point. I think we've heard you. Let's hear what other folks are saying, what they think, what their reaction is to, should the number be lower than 486? And I will ask people.
Well, I have a question, like when the original Grizzled Fig legislation came through, how was that characterized? Because it wasn't that way predates criteria and TMDLs and all that, but people knew there was a problem. How did they push that through their commission board?
Can we table this? And I want to try and have a conversation about one, or how
think-
does this relate? Yeah.
So, I mean, my opinion is, I understand Jeff's point, and it's a valid concern because we're trying to come up with these magic numbers that, you know, if I'm at 9.2, I'm good. If I'm 9.4, I'm bad. We all know that nature does not work that way. So that's why I asked the question. I don't have an answer. I don't know if that's right or not. I just know that whatever's less than what we got now is good. So anything that we can do to make it less, that's a good thing.
So most years were higher than 486. And so if we took the same number that was adopted originally, that's the 486. If we were able to achieve 486, that's lower than where we are now. Whether or not that's the right number, if the right number is lower, that's Jeff's question to the group.
Yeah.
So I'm curious to hear what others think. I might ask somebody by name if you guys don't volunteer. Stacy.
So I think from the Pinellas standpoint, I mean, we know we've got to do more, but I think to Jeff's point is maybe this is not the right, we still need to continue to research, collect more data. I think the analyses that have been done so far still need work. We're not ready to go forward and say, let's go through this whole process of rulemaking change and all that without further study. Because we do want to make sure that we have a closer number. I mean, you know, we're doing what we can do. We're going to continue to do projects, but again, like Jeff said, it's going to throw a lot of folks out of compliance just to change this number when it may not even be the right path right now.
Those are important points. Can I ask you, do you think that 486 is too high of a number to be shooting for? Or do you think by getting down to 486 that might be good enough, whether or not how we approach it? Or do you think we should just keep on doing what we're doing and research things?
I think we don't know the number, you know, so I don't know if 486 is the magic number or not. Again,
Right now, we're based on a hydrologically normalized version of 486. So that's where we're at. And the question is, so.
well, I think that we're definitely not comfortable going away from hydrological normalization at this point.
Explain to folks why.
Well, we know that on rainy years, we're gonna have more input of the load. The loads are gonna be higher. Obviously, that's bad, but we can't control the rainfall. You know, also, we know atmospheric deposition, you know, that's also gonna be more impactful on rainy years. I mean, so I think you have to consider rainy year impacts. We can't control those, you know? Anybody else want to?
Thank you for sharing that. I really appreciate you sort of taking the first stab.
I have to concur with Pinellas County. City of Tampa is not ready to change to absolutes at this moment. It puts our MS4 out of compliance and we can't support that. We do currently support your analysis for normalization right now. At this time, I'm gonna have to also support Chris's comments and Jeff's as well online.
We will have space for all of that conversation too. I am not trying to be a jerk, but what I am trying to get is, I think Jeff posed this different question to the room.
Right.
Do you all agree with what Jeff is saying, is that the number is very likely less than 486. You guys have an appetite to go lower than 486? Is Jeff on a panel? Dave?
So, agree with Stacy. I don't think we really know what a lower number should be. And I do think that we all need to do more. Yes, we need to get more reductions. But if you ask me like, well, what number should we target lower than 46? I don't know. And I just don't think we know that right now. Okay, so that's the answer to that part.
Jeff, I've heard no one in the room say that they are, they think it's important to go to a lower number than 486, but there is opinions that it could be valuable to continue to study to see if we could have greater, stronger evidence in terms of a lower number. But generally, I'm not hearing support for the idea that 480, lower than 486 is the.
Right, well, if I came across that way, what I'm suggesting is that it's hard for me to go to leadership with a firm 486 when I see a figure in the report that says the confidence interval for that being successful is it's like 60% or 65%. That's what I'm actually saying. I'm agreeing with what everybody just said. We don't know what the number is. It may be 500. It may be 450. I don't know. It may be 300 for all I know. I've always been of the opinion that the hydrologic modification that's making this bay segment look so different than everything else. And that apparently is not getting fixed. So I don't know where the number is, but my point is twofold. One, I'm not confident, I'm not comfortable, or I won't go to leadership and say this is the right number, whether it be higher or lower, in the absence of better science or a better confidence interval at a minimum. And two, I could never recommend opening two final orders that expose the other, one of which would expose all three bay segments to similar criticism, and the other one would open up everybody in this specific bay segment. I mean, we could have the whole thing fall apart without a higher comfort level that this will work.
Okay, I hear you. Did you want to weigh in?
No, I think Jeff clarified. I thought really that was the main thing is like, what is the skill of the model to predict success or failure if we implement certain actions? And I think what Jeff is saying and what others would run into, I would run into the same problem, is saying, if we meet this number, everything's going to be great. And I'm not going to be coming back to you in 5, 10, 15 years for another group of projects. So I do think that maybe we should look at some different, loading numbers in the model to see if we can improve or tighten up. So I think Jeff's point is that that confidence interval will overlap the predicted or the required target, right? And you want to be able to walk in the room and say, I have a really high level of confidence if we do A, B, and C, or if you invest in A, B, and C, we're going to get the desired outcome, right? Especially with the current backdrop of, austerity and government and all that stuff. So, Jeff, did I capture that okay?
Yes, exactly. I don't know what the right number is, but I don't like that what we've statistically captured to date as this firm number being something I can hang my hat on as being successful. And we're talking about probably hundreds of millions of dollars of regional stormwater investment to address this. You're not getting it out of the wastewater plants. We don't have very much to give. So
I've been listening, this is Ed again, and kind of want to respond just to clarify sort of the evidence that we've developed. If you go back all the way back to the 1990s when we started on this process of trying to manage nitrogen loads for the benefit of improving water quality and support seagrass recovery. So the 486 number is based on creating a conducive light environment for seagrass coverage. We've been continuing to see declines in seagrass coverage in Old Tampa Bay. We know that chlorophyll conditions, water clarity conditions are probably not supportive of seagrasses as it stands right now. We've heard pretty wholeheartedly from all the groups that we've talked to one-on-one that Old Tampa Bay is not at an ecosystem state that everyone agrees is good, and that something needs to be done. So the evidence that we've built so far is based on some of that empirical modeling approach, and we've improved upon that. The specific graphics that Jeff is talking about relate to the likelihood of meeting that chlorophyll target that would produce a light environment in the future based on nutrient loading over the full gamut of the time period that we have available information. So that's 1985 through 2021. I think for those updated logistic models, they use the most recent contemporary period from 2000 to 2021 of loading conditions relative to observed chlorophyll. What that logistic regression analysis suggests that if you move closer to a 486 tons per year absolute loading target, you have greater likelihood to meet that chlorophyll A condition. If we remain static at the hydrologic normalized loads, there is no relationship whatsoever. There's not a good trigger that creates concordance with meeting that hydrologic normalization in a certain chlorophyll A condition in Old Tampa Bay. And you can see it in terms of our compliance assessments, where we continue to show reductions in the normalized loads to Old Tampa Bay, and we're not meeting chlorophyll conditions conducive to seagrass, and we're continuing to see declining seagrass coverage conditions 2016 to the latest assessment. It's the only base segment that this is occurring. That's why we're going down this path to talk about what is the path forward to provide a recovery path for this Bay segment and specifically. So regardless of the tool used, CHASM, Old Tampa Bay integrated model, if you reduce the external loads going into Tampa Bay, you're going to reduce the chlorophyll conditions. Those are consistent model results no matter what. The argument is how much are those reduced? It's a simple mass balance equation. You put more nutrients in the system, you're going to get more primary production. That primary production right now in Old Tampa Bay is resulting in more phytoplankton and potentially more macroalgae in the system that is not conducive to seagrass recovery. So whether or not the number is 46, whether or not the number is 450, whether or not the number is 550, what needs to be done is we need to go on a diet. We've been talking about this in Old Tampa Bay for quite some time. The status quo is not going to allow us to regain seagrasses in Old Tampa Bay. We're offering up a recommendation that is incrementally trying to get us towards that path of recovery. We think it's a pragmatic recommendation because it is based on the federally recognized TMDL, all the empirical modeling, mechanistic modeling that has gone back to the mid-1990s. And in terms of the compliance assessments that have been set up to address reasonable assurance in Tampa Bay, it's at the base segment level. So if we're approaching or starting to meet those 486 tons per year, we're expecting chlorophyll conditions to go down. The last 2-3 years are probably indicative of what happens when we have less loading going into Old Tampa Bay. We've met chlorophyll conditions from 2022 to now 2024. Marcus is going to talk about that in just a second. So we know there's still a connection with nitrogen loading and Old Tampa Bay's chlorophyll conditions. What we're trying to do through this reasonable assurance process, and that is the trigger in the future of putting, so to speak, permit holders in the Old Tampa Bay segment out of compliance. If we meet chlorophyll conditions consistently, we're never going to get to the point where we'd be assessing MS4 permit and specific allocations to that level because we're meeting water quality conditions conducive of seagrass. And that's at the base of the reasonable assurance assessments that we do on an annual basis. So that is sort of the pragmatic steps we're trying to get towards. We recognize there's probably no magic numbers in all this, but we feel that there's pretty strong evidence that the numbers that have been produced are going to put us on a better path forward moving forward. than the path we are currently now. And a lot of that is some of the masking that's happening with the hydrologic normalization compliance assessment process. And that's fundamentally, I think, wrong for Old Tampa Bay because there's no direct connection with achieving chloroflay conditions conducive for seagrass. And that's sort of the crux of the science and clarity I'd like to provide, to what Jeff said. And I'll be happy to kind of respond more to that. But that's bringing us up to speed, hopefully level setting of where we're at in Old Tampa Bay. And I'll talk a little bit more about it when we talk about what the decision manual is actually saying. But that's basically the state of the science where we're at now. We could continue to research, analyze, but I think what has proven successful in the past is action for the region, and that was prompted through a lot of these initial analyses.
And Sarasota Bay, the bias towards action through the project.
So that's what we're trying to get towards, and I think what we've shown is there's probably not enough action to get us to an effect that will improve chlorophyll conditions. There's more that needs to be done.
Proactive versus reactive. Well, Ed, why don't you, I mean, unless there's other comments or Maya, you want input from others? Maybe Ed, you can just kind of go over the decision memo and we can continue that discussion a little bit.
Before I launch into another soliloquy, I would welcome any other comments. I don't want to be talking at you. I just want to level set and provide some clarity to some of the comments that have been made. Because there has been a line of science and research investment to get us to this place. We recognize there's issues in Old Tampa Bay. We're trying to come up with a path forward for this segment to put that back on better track. So I'll stop there. Go ahead.
Okay,
Yeah.
so this is my take on what I've been hearing from everybody is that I don't think anybody is disagreeing that the number should go down and we should reduce nitrogen. But I think what I'm hearing is that most people's issue is not what they're reducing of the nitrogen so much as being out of compliance with their permitting. So potentially a step forward is either a stepwise and it's put into the new regulations, a stepwise down to a certain level so that people have time to get and they're not out of compliance always for like 10 years or I know you said something with like, if we're meeting chlorophyll A, we're not out of compliance with the MS4 and blah, 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 all the things of explaining more clearly how even if we go to this 486 absolute, that does not mean we're out of compliance necessarily with their MS4 or with our permitting. Or if we are, how that is gonna like affect us, kind of.
Yeah, that's actually an awesome segue to actually my first slide. And it's kind of reinforcing and sort of level setting what our reasonable assurance assessment framework has been. This goes back to the development of our 2009 reasonable assurance addendum, where the first measure is chlorophyll A conditions in each of the bay segments. We've developed specific targets and thresholds for each of the bay segment. That's the trip point of whether or not we drill down to loading conditions and entity specific loading conditions. And it's really the path that it's the road that it's basically the process that we are now on. Based on the 2022 reasonable assurance update findings, we basically fell out into that red highlighted area where we were achieving the hydrologically normalized TMDL, but we were not meeting the chlorophyll A conditions. And that we set up ourselves in 2009, said, here's what we're gonna do when that condition happens. We're gonna reinterrogate what the summative load capacity for that specific bay segment is, because there's a disconnect between the ecological indicator, chlorophyll A conditions, and what's occurring in terms of hydrologically normalized loading. So that action is the process that we're undertaking now with Stantec to try to understand and drill down into the Old Tampa Bay segment further to see how we could get back into compliance in the eyes of DEP through this reasonable assurance process. And again, the first measure is meeting chlorophyll A conditions If we do not meet chlorofluoride conditions in 2 concurrent years, that triggers sort of the next assessment step of looking at total baywide loads relative to either a hydrologically normalized TUMDale like we're doing now, or an absolute load of 486, which we've been recommending. And that is sort of the trigger that we've heard concerns about, that exposes people that have both MS4 and wastewater permits, because if we don't meet chlorofluoride conditions in 2 concurrent years, we're going to be taking a look at loadings at the baywide level. And there's going to be differences in terms of compliance right now, meeting an absolute load versus a hydrologically normalized load. We've shown that in various graphs. I think what we've been trying to do with some of the model assessments is show you how much delta and projects that we know are in the bin that will get us closer to meeting an absolute loading condition. And that is usually justification enough for DEP to maintain a reasonable assurance determination for this segment as well as the entirety of Tampa Bay. And that's the process that, you know, we're trying to engender and move forward. We hear the concerns at an individual entity basis that, you know, there's fear that you guys are going to be automatically out of compliance. That isn't necessarily the case until, you know, we're down the road and we experience chlorofluoride conditions again for a prolonged couple of years that will sort of trigger those levels of assessment. But I think the back stuff is we've now gained enough information that if we do this, and this, then there's more of a likelihood that we'll meet those chlorofluoride conditions in the future. I don't know if that completely answered your question and put you at peace, but that's the sort of the process we're thinking about through the reasonable assurance updates.
I do think we are automatically out of compliance under the terms of the QBELs. I understand this framework is different from an RA perspective, but the QBEL has an individual load, and in some cases is subsequently normalized, and in other cases is a firm load. Yep. If Hillsborough has a 91 ton per year stormwater load in that QBEL and they hit 100 tons, they're out of compliance, Ed. And DEP can choose or not choose to pursue them. Just like in our permits, in our MPDS permits, I have a load. If I exceed that load, they will pursue me independent of the health of the bay.
Yeah,
They've let us know that already.
Those loads and compliance and what has been asked from DEP in the past has been a desire to see those expressed as a 5-year average over each RA cycle relative to the allocations. And we provide that information now as appendices to each successive reasonable assurance update. So there are folks that are both below and above those allocations as we've been reporting to DEP now. And I'm not sure I've heard of any sort of hammer being, brought down on individuals like you're suggesting, because for the most part, we've seen successful recovery and maintaining chlorofluoride conditions over each of the RA periods. So I don't think that our reporting is going to be different. Right, I understand your concern, Jeff. I do. Yeah. I hear what you're saying, but there's instances already occurring where that's taking place, and I'm not sure that there's the level of scrutiny that you're suggesting happening right now.
Hey, sure. this is Ilya. I just wanted to ask real quick, because I don't know if there's be situation since the limit is already in the permit, that the DEP would agree to do administrative orders for those that aren't, instead of being enforcement action, to be an administrative order for those that would, be exceeding.
I think they would, Ilya. That would be historically how DEP would have handled it.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking too, because we are already be implementing corrective actions. So, hopefully that would be something that could be worked out.
Right, but typically they won't issue an AO for more than 5 years, and these types of capital projects are probably not breaking ground for 5 years.
Again, it would be. It would have to be.
I don't think the normalization is right. I don't want to be misunderstood here. I'm just not sure that this is the cleanest bath, and I'm still super uncomfortable with the confidence interval presented in the CAS 2 report.
Yeah, and that, I was gonna share a personal experience, but I think Ilya covered it. We had an existing discharge to a segment that got a new TMDL. We negotiated an administrative order to do some projects over a period of time and bring the facility into compliance, and did that, reduce the nutrients in the discharge and back in compliance within the 5-year period. Now, Jeff makes a point about the duration of time that DEP is kind of stretched out. I don't have any personal experience there, but other than to say they were typically either issued for 5 years or ran with the duration of the permit, which is renewed on a 5-year cycle. And I would think that if you had a plan that you committed to that was of a longer duration, you would be able to probably work through that with the department. But I think that's something that, you know, if I'm one of these entities in Old Tampa Bay, and I would be concerned about, I'm going out of compliance, at the stroke of a pen, so to speak. Those are probably discussions I would need to have, with DEP before we made any commitment.
Those would all be things that we would advance through an addendum process where we're going back and forth, and then there would be a lot more clarity that's offered there, but we kind of have to get to the point where we know what's going in an addendum.
Yeah, and then we never really got to Jeff's second comment. I'm sorry, I'm not trying to get away from your discussion, Ed, but
please.
maybe we can revisit it later. But this idea of like when we reopen, these final orders, like what kind of assurances can we get that? I mean, I think there are legitimate technical scientific reasons to say, look, Old Tampa Bay is different, causeways, freshwater inputs, control structures on lake, whatever you want to say. But, that is, I think, something that, me over in a different part of the bay, I would be interested in hearing more about from a legal perspective, how that might work.
Yeah, and I think, this is an initial question, whether or not shifting from a hydrologically normalized load and an absolute load, what does that process look like, framed within the reasonable assurance updates and delivering that information to DEP? I think some of the individual entity concerns that have been expressed and some of the administrative orders that have been issued in response to specific TMDLs, the reasonable assurance process is supposed to be collectively addressing that at the base segment level across all entities involved. So that's sort of the cover of why we're all for one for all, working on this issue collectively together, because we were going to put this in a package to DEP that says, there's some different way of managing the system that's needed. Here it is, and here's how we're going to get there. That over the next 5-year implementation period is, up to DEP to decide whether or not that provides them enough reasonable assurance to accept those recommendations and meet the guidelines of meeting water quality conditions conducive for seagrass in the future. So that's what we're trying to offer as cover to everyone that we're talking about in the room today in terms of this reasonable assurance process, because that's how we've been operating at the base segment level collectively with all the entities in the room. And I agree that there's probably individual TMDLs that the department's responding to, but at the base segment level, we've been kind of true to this process of working together towards collective nitrogen load reductions that have a benefit for each of the base segments. And that's what we'll continue to kind of report on in the future. The process of updating the numeric nutrient criteria, that's basically what the decision memo is asking of the department. Is this feasible? Would this be feasible? The next steps is, as Maya mentioned, we have to develop an addendum, this additional justification of why we think this is a more reasonable approach to maintain reasonable assurance in the Old Tampa Bay segment. And we got to deliver that to DEP at the end of 2027 as the next reasonable assurance update that will hopefully provide that assurance over the next 5 years, 2027 to 2031 period, that if we do these things, then we are likely to meet chlorophyll A conditions conducive for seagrass recovery in the Bay segment moving forward. And that is some of the beauty of being in a reasonable assurance process and update process that we've been doing going all the way back to 2001, rather than you all going individually alone and trying to address impairments that we know are happening in Old Tampa Bay, in discrete conversations with DEP. We're all in this together. We recognize that there's multiple sources of nutrients going into that base segment. Here's what we could do to collectively address it. Stacy, I'm still only on my first slide.
I can
Yeah, go ahead. No, I don't want to stop.
discuss, we talked with you guys last week and Kelly was in the conversation as well. You know, one thing that we were curious about, and going back and looking at some of the initial slides from when we were starting the new study, it was mentioned that there's a panel of experts, Holly and others, who are reviewing this. But, you know, we mentioned we would like to see what did the experts, because I'm not a model expert by any means. So I would like to know, what did the experts think about this model? What did they suggest? Is there a way to tighten the confidence interval? You know, this is just one proposal. You know, there's multiple complicated confounding factors as, you know, stated in the memo. I would like to, first of all, know, you know, what did they think? What were their recommendations? Was everybody good with this? Did they say this is definitely something that needs to happen? And does it have to happen right now? Can we wait until the whole assimilative capacity is done? You know, we're not even done yet, right? There's still just now presenting task 3. Isn't there also a task 4? You know, I just feel like this might be a little rushed to propose it to DEP at this point.
Yeah, fair enough. And, you know, based on your comments, we're going to make those comments available to as appendices to each of the task reports. But also recognize that each task is kind of building off one another as well. So if we do nothing, there's no additional tasks that are necessary because we're not making any recommendation for changes at that point.
But we have to make a recommendation to DEP to do the rest of the task.
So this was sort of the conclusions of the 2020 reasonable assurance update that we provided to DEP for that compliance assessment period from 2017 to 2021, where we were out of compliance in chlorofluoric conditions. We said there's additional refinements that are needed in Old Tampa Bay. We recognize there's issues there. There's probably multiple interventions that could be pursued. We need to investigate how we could fully implement those interventions to bring us back to meet water quality conditions in the future. That's what we committed to when we delivered this at the tail end of 2022, set us on the path of doing this assimilative capacity assessment. The initial task 1 through 3 work has brought us to a recommendation that we know is not palatable, everyone in the room, you know, and we're trying to work towards, you know, what is going to be palatable moving forward, and recognizing that Old Tampa Bay is not where it's at, where it needs to be at. We've provided sort of these additional analyses and provided you some both empirical and mechanistic models that are different from some of the looks that we've done in the past. If those aren't acceptable, we need to come to a point as a body to respond to what we provided in the last regional assurance update to DEP and EPA, and they accepted with the caveats that we were going to look at Old Tampa Bay under a much finer microscope. What are the alternatives at this point? We provided you a recommendation. If that recommendation is not acceptable to the group, then we probably need to do some additional work over the next, so we're running out of time, like 2 years before the next 2027 RA update is going to be due to DEP. We think we're on a better path with the recommendations that we've shown, but again, we recognize that it's not completely acceptable to everyone in the room at this point. So if that's the case, we need to probably roll up our sleeves and get to work fairly quickly in short order to address issues that in Old Tampa Bay. And come up with different alternatives. And that at that point, we're going to put on you because we provided information, we've invested in these analyses. And if you guys aren't happy with them, then we need to hear back from you guys what is going to be palatable moving forward for this base segment. And this just this is yeah. So this graphic is getting to, I think, some of the points that Jeff was making before, his discomfort of moving forward with this recommendation just based on sort of separation of the absolute TN loading and the likelihood of meeting chlorofluoride target. This remains the primary recommendation that the decision memo is based on. that we're gonna ask you if you guys want to vote on that, to forward it to DEP to see what their input is on that process of potentially looking at absolute load as the compliance assessment framework for the space segment in the future. And a lot of it hinges on the loading and chlorophyll A conditions that we've experienced in the past, as well as some additional chasm modeling work that has been invested in over the past year. So again, I will reiterate, all the tools we have in the toolbox suggest that if we lower nitrogen loads from what they currently are, we will probably have a beneficial effect on chlorophyll A conditions that are conducive to seagrass recovery in Old Tampa Bay. What that absolute loading number might be in any given year is probably subject to debate, depending on the tool used. But approaching the 486 federally recognized TMDL that all allocations were originally based on, we think is a pragmatic path forward to get us on a road to success in Old Tampa Bay. Again, we have both empirical and mechanistic modeling evidence to suggest that that's the case, and that's why we're forwarding this recommendation and garnering this feedback from the group. And
Ed,
I think
that is the graph that concerns me right there, the one that you just showed, the absolute TN. It basically shows that at whatever 20 tons, I'm barely over 85% confidence that we'll meet our chlorophyll A attainment goals. This is what's problematic to me. That was in the report, and it's not about being dissatisfied with them. It's that this makes me feel like we work towards the 486 rather than working towards an appropriate number. Because 40.5 times 12 is 486, right?
Yeah,
Yes,
yeah. So these blue lines are basically the bounding box of the likelihood of attaining the chlorophyll A condition in the future, relative to basically status quo conditions of extreme hydrologic is this black dotted bounding box. So as we further reduce loads, there's a greater likelihood that we'll meet chlorophyll A targets. That's just the nature of a logistic model.
Yep.
What I think this is also relaying there's clearly no relationship right now with attaining a hydrologic normalization delivery ratio close to what we have and attaining it. There's not more confidence in attaining that chlorophyll A condition in the future using that hydrologically normalized metric as the benchmark. So that's what these graphs are kind of relaying, and I get your concern, but there's confidence intervals around averages, annual averages as well, in terms of chlorophyll A conditions, and that's just the subject of making these estimates based on the data that's on hand. The absolute TN loads still give me greater confidence that as we approach 486 and even crank it down further, that we are probably going to be in a very better state than we are now.
No, I couldn't agree more, and maybe that's why I came across as having the expectation that it may be below 486. But again, it's hard for me to go to leadership and say, yeah, I want to invest $100 million on a regional stormwater system, and oh, by the way, I got a 70% likelihood of it being successful. That's just simply not how engineers operate. I couldn't do that. I wouldn't do that.
Yeah, you got a 0% chance now. So, I mean,
No, not 0% right now. We're hitting every once in a while. We're hitting it. That's why we haven't been kicked into this. Shockingly, we haven't been kicked into this situation because in the 11th hour on every cycle, we somehow attained our numbers and met the criteria of the reasonable assurance document. I can't explain that part. But what I can say is I can't go to leadership and say I want, and maybe Glicksburg has a different opinion, but in Hillsborough, there's no way they're going to invest that kind of money on this.
Sarasota County has. And they don't even have a RA plan.
Well, and that was one of the questions that we asked folks is, so if you don't feel comfortable showing them this, how are you gonna get them to invest in these kinds of load reduction projects? If you don't even have that you're like, how are you convincing people to do these projects right now on a voluntary basis? You know, we've heard that people want to keep doing what they're doing. We've shown that the projects and the pace that it's currently at is not sufficient to accomplish that. So I'm not sure how we provide you the support to generate the political will to invest in the load reduction projects. We're very open to your suggestions of the ways that you think you could help make that case. But we don't have evidence to suggest some higher confidence interval right now. Like, this is the best that we can do from the science that we have on hand.
And basically, that summarizes a lot of the one-on-one conversations that we've had with staff and each of the individual entities, recognizing that the conditional Old Tampa Bay is not acceptable, that there's probably going to be something else needed for investments to be triggered to respond to Old Tampa Bay's conditions now. And that's, we've heard from some of y'all, a regulatory requirement such as what we're recommending might be the way to garner that political will and investment in the future. And we also heard that there's strong preference not to reallocate existing loads within that segment. So that is where we've gone down this path of recommending the 486 tons per year, because it does not affect allocations. It affects how we assess compliance in the future at the base segment level. And we also heard from y'all that, you know, load reductions are not the only mechanism to achieve beneficial ecological conditions in Old Tampa Bay. And we've tried to simulate and model some of those alternative management interventions that will complement all the work and investments that you guys are going to be focused on in the future. So that's kind of building to where we're at in terms of a decision memo and the recommendation. We've had some preliminary conversations with DEP last fall when this recommendation was first being developed. And it's basically addressing that first bullet just from verbal conversations with DEP. They thought an absolute load could be used as a numeric nutrient criteria. There's other examples in the state where a load is expressed within state statute for a nitrogen and or a phosphorus numeric nutrient criteria. They also suggested that if we went this route for TN, then there is a TP numeric nutrient criteria for the Old Tampa Bay segment. We haven't done any analyses on those as of yet, but they would also suggest if we move to an absolute load for TN, that we'd also look for a recommendation for TP. I think just looking at the raw data, I think both on a hydrologically normalized delivery ratio as well as an absolute loading basis, TP is fine in the space segment, but don't quote me on that. I know this is probably being recorded, but I think TP wise, we're fine in the Old Tampa Bay segment. And then the next series of bullets are not addressed in this decision memo, but we've been hearing them come up. Jeff has actually raised them in this meeting as well. What is the process and timeline for adjusting the currently recognized numeric nutrient criteria in statute? We're not sure. We haven't got that feedback from DEP. That's the point of forwarding a decision memo so that they could officially respond to it and provide that guidance back to us, because they are the regulatory bodies in charge of developing these standards that we would assess in the future. And then, you know, the talk of you know, individual compliance versus RA compliance. It's our anticipation, if this recommendation continues to move forward, that it's part of this current RA cycle's reasonable assurance documentation update to DEP, that by nature would necessitate sort of a compliance of looking at an absolute load over the next RA period cycle, which would be the 2027 to 2031 period. And that would be sort of the first time we'd start tracking when we do not meet chlorophyll A conditions in 2 concurrent years. We would start taking a look at the absolute load at that point at the base segment level. And that has been sort of the spirit of the reasonable assurance process and the updates. We'll need further guidance and clarification from the department on that. But we're basically just asking for the first bullet at this point, because that sets us up to develop more of the documentation in a reasonable assurance addendum, that it will be part of the overall 2027 reasonable assurance update plan. All that being said, we do have a decision memo process. I don't know if we're at the point where you guys want to take a vote. We do have a decision memo. There was a protocol that was developed at the tail end of the 2009 RA addendum that has two different tiered voting processes, basically recognizing all consortium members in the decision versus only those that have funded the RA cycle. I think we're at a point, this is a consortium recommendation, so I don't think we need to like tally up who has funded the RA process so far to take this vote, if you want to take a vote. But there is that tiered approach that we've already adopted as part of prior reasonable assurance updates. And last but not least, we've been providing this decision memo in its draft form, going back to, I think it was October when we first distributed it. We talked about it in December. We didn't receive any major comments. There were some just minor clarifications and updates that have happened since then, but the body has remained largely the same. We are asking the department their opinion on moving towards an absolute loading threshold for the old Tampa Bay segment, and whether or not that is what's the word I'm looking for? Whether or not the department would allow that to occur in updating a numeric nutrient criteria. So it's a first step. I don't suspect the department is automatically going to enter into rulemaking to change a numeric nutrient criteria based on this decision memo. It's just asking them for feedback if that's a palatable path forward.
If you look at the history of the consortium, these decision memos end up being a series of back and forths to clarify, and then it gets written into an RA addendum. So it's not like we did it. This is just like how we start to answer those questions.
So again, I'll stop talking, ask for any comments, but it's really on this body of whether or not you guys have any comfort on voting on this, if we need to go back and reformulate different alternatives that we're going to put on you this time. We've provided some recommendations, and we're going to, if these aren't acceptable, then we need to come back and have some facilitated discussions on what is the alternative pathway. And we need to hash that out probably over the next 2 to 3 months fairly quickly, which will be another series of meetings. So I'll stop, see if there's reaction comments, and we'll go from here.
I had a question on I think what you said, and obviously we're not an entity here, but it's just for my clarification. The decision memo is to get comment from DEP that says absolute loading, going to an absolute load would be an acceptable way to develop compliance for the Bay. It's not asking for that move towards absolute loading. Is that correct?
It's a structured decision-making process. And so it is formalizing the questions that you all are expressing today. It's formalizing those as saying, we all share these questions. We want to know how our regulators, view these things. They provide counsel back. There will be a letter response. They might come, we might have a discussion at a future meeting. You all will weigh in what that response is, whether or not it's acceptable to you, or you might generate an alternative path, an alternative set of questions that you then codify in another decision memo that gets posed as a question to DEP and EPA. We go through this as many iterations as we want till we come to a consensus point. We articulate that in an RA addendum. And then that RA addendum is informing the reasonable assurance plan moving forward and how we assess compliance, how we're working to demonstrate reasonable assurance that Old Tampa Bay will meet so it's just like basically pushing us into this structured decision-making process where we can flow chart diagram all of these things. You get the kind of certainty that you're looking for in terms of the partners who are helping, to oversee this process. So it's sort of out of this sort of just reporting or listening kind of phase and into this active deciding phase, and what information do you need to decide?
How quickly could we look at the peer review comments, the things that you said that you'll get to us?
Yeah, we provide them after the meeting.
For everything but task 3.
Yeah.
Task 3 isn't done yet.
Because I think I'd like to again, just see what the experts thought about this whole process and, you know, before I say, yeah, I'm ready to send this to DEP. Not that we would be completely opposed, but I just don't know if today is the day. I think we need a little bit more information personally.
Yeah, we provide that after the meeting. If there's not an interest to take a vote, we could potentially do it remotely, I guess, if you guys don't want to meet again. This decision point puts us on a path of how we draft that addendum. So I'd rather not wait several more months because we've already promised the addendum to DEP at the tail end of 2024, and we're now in April 2025.
I mean, I would put out there as a question for those maybe most impacted, potentially down the road. You said that you did not receive a lot of feedback on the drafts of the decision memo, but now that it's maybe very clear that due to timing and the way the next cycle is working out, that we've approached the decision point, or we're approaching a point where we need to take some kind of action. Should we delay this, allow everyone to look at that kind of peer review? Give everyone one more opportunity to provide comment on the memo as it's currently, drafted, and then meet again next month?
That's the will.
We're open to, at this point, we're stewarding a process for you all. So you need to tell us if you need more time, how much time do you need? What additional information do you need? And how would you like to, convene another meeting going forward? So I've heard we can provide the additional peer reviewed information, at least for task 1 and 2. We'll provide that to you today. How much time do you need to review it? And how would you like to meet to discuss it? Heather.
Maya, there's also value in bringing this information to your management board and your policy board. You're talking about triggering 62-302, and without policy board full support, I don't see how that is something that we should move forward with. I also think that the management board may also have some insight on cost benefit analysis. That's something that scientists aren't giving you. Management has their handle on those type of costs and what we would each be facing. So, and I'm not sure how you're going to base the allocations, or if you're going to go back and revert to your 2007 RA.
There'd be no reallocating based on this process.
So the recognized federal TMDL, which is the 486, when you do the individual allocations and you go back to the 2007 RA, Tampa's only responsible for 20.1 tons. So it's also going to depend on your path moving forward on who are the players and where does that responsibility fall as far as monetary costs.
So there's one thing that I want others to weigh in on that you said for sure, and that is the suggestion. Rather than following the funding and voting protocol that is laid out with the final consortium action, Heather's suggesting that you all kind of come to a consensus, but before there's any actual action, this goes through an alternative pathway for decision-making where the management board and the policy board weigh in on the recommendation that's before. Do others like that? Do others agree that that's a better path? Would you like the policy board to decide how we move forward? It's a different process than what we've articulated in the Tampa Bay Nitrogen Management Consortium in the past. And so what do others think?
I mean, I think I can't speak for Pinellas County, Board of Commissioners. I mean, I would definitely feel more comfortable for them knowing that this is something to be considered and be able to present them, like you say, with the cost impacts, like what is this going to mean for our county? And
Yeah.
I mean,
So
yeah.
if we can't, all right, Dave, yeah.
Sorry.
No,
I was gonna
it's good. It's good. I want to hear from you guys.
basically kind of say the same thing. I think it would be a good way to bring in some, elected officials to be aware of the decisions needing to be made.
So if they were acting on the decision memo, is that what you're asking for the policy board to weigh in on the decision memo? Is that, I just want
There's
to.
no cost.
So then, if the policy board says yes, how does it affect, so this body would be bound and you would agree to be bound by what the policy board votes? And at this point in time, we cannot answer many of the questions that you have articulated because those answers come later in a back and forth with regulatory agencies. Yeah, I just want to, like, I'm trying to like chart out, we're gonna have to chart out what the new path is. This is a completely different approach.
I just think the feedback is valuable from the policy board and the management board. I mean, you could get full support, you could get, you know, a split, a 50-50. I think that the more informed, that more bodies are, that I think that
So I
that
think
could
we've
give you
provided
more support.
updates to both the management board and policy board along the way as information items. So I don't think that this is a surprise to any of those entities. We have had quite a bit of turnover on our policy board. But to me, we would never keep this information from those entities. It's a matter of where the decision-making authority lies and whether or not you all are saying you would prefer that the policy board decide on these kinds of questions, or you'd prefer to keep the decision-making authority here with those entities who have contributed and have the permitted allocations in the process.
I don't disagree. Maybe some.
I do not like that. We need our science tightened up and then make a decision based on that. I just go back where I was from the beginning. A 40% versus a 60% success rate change does not give me warm fuzzies about putting $50 million forward on a regional or more on a regional stormwater treatment unit. And there's nowhere else to get these reductions other than shutting off the Tarpon Canal, Lake Tarpon Canal. There's nowhere, guys. Atmospheric deposition is atmospheric deposition. We cannot change that. The Senate Bill 64 is going to reduce what little is left of the domestic plants. There's only one place to get this. This is out of our stormwater discharges. They're going to shoot it down when they hear the kind of numbers we're talking about if we don't have good science behind it.
So this kind of direction for change, I hear one person saying something. I'm certainly not hearing consensus from others. If there's a motion you'd like to put forward for the consortium to weigh in on, but I need, right now I'm being governed, the process that I'm stewarded is being governed by this funding and voting protocol in the way that we've done before. My job is not for a particular outcome, it's to steward a process. So I'm trying to stick with the process that you have articulated. If you want to change the process, we can absolutely do that, but you're gonna have to spell out what that process is and have consensus on it. Right now, I'm not hearing consensus that the policy board should be the ones to take over the decision-making authority. I am hearing that everyone agrees that they should be on an information basis, kept in the loop of what's going on. And I think that that's absolutely a service that we can provide.
Yeah, Heather, I want to make sure we're not putting words in your mouth or in Dave's. So you're just saying that you want to make sure that before we move forward, that both the policy and the management board have had an opinion or an opportunity.
For feedback,
For
yes.
feedback,
I believe before we send a letter to the outside agencies, to DEP and to the EPA, that you have either a full support, which would strengthen anything that has to do with monetary and financial costs, as well as your Stantec proposal. So I think that those two pieces together would help with a vote in this NNC consortium.
Yeah, and just for everyone's level setting again, there are a couple other recommendations in the Stantec report, and we absolutely were going to run those recommendations that are based mainly on updating management targets and or habitat restoration targets for the bay, for that bay segment in particular. We absolutely think those need to be vetted and approved through the management conference. The decisions on nitrogen load management and reductions have always been centered in the nitrogen management consortium. So if there's a different approval process like Maya suggesting, then we need to hear that from the consortium now, because that's different than how we've operated in the past with managing nitrogen loads comprehensively for entities that are not represented on our management and policy board. And there are some in the room. So that would be a deviation of how we manage nitrogen loads in the past. We're not opposed to going that path. We just need to hear that there's consensus that that's the new path forward to get approvals. Because it's different than how we've operated through the consortium.
They just give us a little time to have the conversations that need to be had.
So how much time are you asking?
What's your, I mean, you know, what is your absolute deadline here? I know 2027, but
So we've missed the deadline. It was the end of 2024 for the addendum. So we missed our deadline at this point in time. We were trying to get something done by this summer. So that's been our goal, what we're driving for in terms of having the addendum completed and submitted to DEP by the summer.
And the first opportunity to kind of have both management and policy board weigh in would be May. And I have no problem presenting this information at both the management and policy board meetings at the May meeting. Again, the question needs to be made if there's an approval through those bodies or a nod that this is a good path forward. What does that mean for the consortium? Are you gonna need more time to weigh that at that point?
Agree with putting it on the other boards, because then you basically, the consortium, that's the point of the consortium. Like, what are we even here for if we don't make these decisions? So like, if you're gonna give away all of our, basically our power, then just do away with the consortium. I mean, so I mean, I can agree with presenting it to the policy and, you know, the other boards, but like, that's literally our one job, is to make these decisions. So it doesn't make sense to give that away.
I'm not proposing to give that away. I'm just proposing that, I mean, I've spoken to my management board. I have not gotten to my policy board member yet. And I don't know if any else in the room has done that as well. But I do agree that we should inform them. I think that would be a positive forward. Next meeting is May, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna ask, when is that meeting in May? Do you know?
It's May 16th.
So that gives about maybe a month for us to maybe look at this a little bit closer and all that. So would that be a good time frame to, again, review the memo again and you have the internal discussions that have to have, and then be able to vote or something to present to the policy board meeting? Is that what we're looking at?
I think we're gonna have to be planning on a presentation to the policy board.
Okay, so
We need
like
to walk away today.
2
knowing
weeks or something before.
The question is, when do you all feel like you would be ready to decide and to act on a decision memo? Yes, no, whatever. But-
Yeah.
But when do you think that it would be, like, how much time do you need to review and have these conversations?
Well, I'm just thinking of it in terms of, we want feedback from those boards. We don't want them to make the decision. That's not what I'm hearing.
I agree.
So in the May meeting, I don't know if you need a motion for this, but we would ask that the staff go over the proposed decision memo with those two boards and bring that feedback to a subsequent meeting. However, the second part of it is the discussions I think that need to happen with individual entities and their elected officials to figure out if they are going to get the support to come back and vote in a meeting, maybe in June, or whenever it can be scheduled, to get support to send this letter. Is that? It's not, it's two steps in my mind, not one.
Proposal.
I mean,
That sounds about right.
okay, so could we get a motion from someone in the room to request that the staff present the draft decision memo to the management and policy boards in the May 16th meeting, and bring that feedback from those meetings, you know, in whatever way is most efficient, which would then be information that individuals could use to speak with their elected officials and management. Does that make sense?
And Tina, that's with the understanding that by doing that presentation, we're not giving away the control or for them, we're not asking for them to make the decision. We're just asking for feedback.
Summarizing feedback that they offer
I
back to
think
you.
we should all just go to our own people and talk to them. I
I,
think you're
I
gonna,
think both things should happen.
yeah, well,
So we have a motion.
I'll just, I'll restate one more time. Without better statistical evaluation, I'm not supporting it. So I'm going to go to my guys and say, it's difficult for me to support such a financial investment. I mean, I'll tell them I think the number's lower. Certainly that figure 3.4 suggests that the lower number is significantly lower. Why can't we ask DEP for some more time and do an actual TMDL and try, instead of trying to work towards a number that, quite frankly, that was developed on a reference period that, quite frankly, looking at the data, wasn't appropriate.
So what I'm hearing here is an alternative path forward. So you could get more time to vote on the information that is at hand on the decision memo that's been proposed. So like, that's, I think, the first thing that was out there. But I think what Jeff might be saying is that there might also be a point at which we could say, no, this isn't what we want to do. There's more information that we want to present, or we want to go back to the drawing board. Maybe we need to sketch out what the right path forward is. Is that something that you're saying, Jeff, or am I hearing you wrong?
No, that is correct. You asked for another alternative other than this process, which, I mean, there aren't a lot of them. One of them is to actually do a real TMDL here. The federally recognized TMDL was based on a reference period that at least hydrologically appears to have been completely inappropriate. Pre and post. It's not like it just changed afterwards. The document talks about it only hydrologically changing after the reference period. But when you look at what was going prior to the reference period, you had a similar hydrologic period as what we have been experiencing for the last 20 years.
So we have a few more minutes of presentations that we need to get through. So I just kind of want to hear the room from the room. Are you guys ready to say, follow with Jeff, and you have alternatives and you want us to set up a path to evaluate your alternatives? Or are you asking for more time to evaluate the option that's been before you and then come and vote for it?
Do we have a motion on the floor?
We do.
No one seconded it, so.
No, it's seconded.
Oh, okay, I didn't hear it there, sorry.
So Jeff is saying he's prepared to vote today. And if the other members are also willing to vote today, that's your question. Or if you want to put up a motion to give.
We have a motion, we have a presentation to the Management Policy Board to convey the feedback back to you all, and for you all to have that extra time to evaluate the Management and Policy Board feedback, for you to spend more time reviewing the decision memo as it's been written, and for you to have also internal conversations with yourself. So that's the motion on the floor with the second.
That's the motion.
All in favor?
Any opposed?
Thank you.
Okay,
So that's one step. Now.
so we'll chart the path later.
Yes. But I don't want to just leave it hanging out there that there is a time element to this. And if those meetings occur now or at those meetings, that information is presented in May, that there are other things happening between when that information is shared, that feedback is shared, and when we get back together, right? Jeff may already be able to say, I can't support it. I'm not going to support it. Just to
You
pick
say
on
other
Jeff.
things happening, you mean the part, like all the entities in the room are having
Those
additional-
discussions on their own privately with their management teams, their elected officials. Or we
Because
can't come back in June and do it.
not be any further.
Right.
And I want to be really clear, you know, there is a fourth task for the Old Tampa Bay Assimilative Assessment, project. But the fourth task is reallocating, and so far, what we've proposed requires no reallocating. So the next step is for us to write an addendum document. We can't do that without this kind of direction from you all. So if you're expecting additional research or action on our part, I just want to be really clear, we don't have that in the plan, and we don't want to develop an addendum without consensus and direction from you all going forward. So the action is going to be, we'll present to the management policy board, but the action is on you all. I just want to be clear.
Yeah. And look, that what I'm just maybe stating the obvious, you know, we may come back in a June meeting after these things have happened, internal discussions, we've gotten feedback, shared that feedback, the peer review information's been shared. Have a vote, and the vote might be, we're not doing it. That's okay. Then I think in that meeting, the discussion we need to be having, well, if the answer is no, then what other technical analysis needs to be done?
And how are we
And
going
how-
to pay for it? Because
Yes.
we're already, like, this contract is done.
Correct.
So if we need to raise more funds to support more work, if we need to let a new contract, you know, all of these things, like, we'll work that forward, but understand there's not, you know, this one's done.
Any other discussion?
Yeah, that was the question I was gonna ask. How much effort would it take to do the TMDL approach that Jeff was talking about? I mean, you only have the data to be able to do that?
I think, can we have that discussion when we get to the point where we're really charting the path forward? There's a couple of things that we need to present on today. They can be relatively quick. But I also need action from you all so that we can submit the compliance assessment, and Marcus can run over that. And then, Ray, I'm gonna bump you, but I will ask Mauricio to provide a very brief update on the effort, to update the action plan database and enhance that for you all. So first we'll have Marcus, and then we'll have Mauricio, and then, we'll be adjourned for the day.
So this is an action item on the agenda. This is much less controversial, so it should be quick. So we're in year 3 of the current RA period. As we've all been talking about, I think we understand the process for what's happening every 5 years and every year in between. We basically provide at the end of each RA period an overall report to DEP, but every year we provide our progress towards each of the 5 years, or that 5-year period. So we're in year 3 of the current period. Right now, we have to submit the 2024 compliance assessment report. We do this every year. We like to submit it around May. And essentially, this is our summary of how we're doing towards attaining the chlorophyll thresholds, and if any additional steps in that RA process need to be pursued. So it's available online. It's a website. There's 3 basic parts: an overview of what the consortium is about, how the compliance assessment works in the second part, and then finally the results for the current year. And I gave the State of the Bay, I think, presentation y'all before, so I think hopefully you're familiar with what water quality has been doing in the last couple of years. But basically, we are maintaining or meeting the threshold in the last 3 years for all the base segments. That's basically because it's been dry. 2024, we had those hurricanes come through. As you know, we actually kind of got very close to exceeding the thresholds. I believe, not very close, but closer to exceeding the thresholds because of the storms, but we're still below if looking at the annual averages. If you want to review this, or rather, well, we need to agree if we're going to submit this to DEP, but there's also a PDF available. Here you can click on and look at the contents as well. It's the same exact thing, but if you want a printable version, it's available. So at this point, we're just looking for an action to basically collectively say we're in agreement to send this to DEP for this year's annual compliance assessment.
You're 3, you're in the green.
I think that's something everyone can get behind. It's good.
Do you need a motion?
Motion to submit to the, whatever. November 2024 reasonable assurance compliance report to DEP.
Thank you.
I second.
All right, all in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Already deal.
Told you that'd be easy.
Thanks, Mark.
Okay, Mauricio, are you there?
Hi, hello. Yes. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. The room can hear you. Do you have slides that you want to share?
Yeah, I can share my screen real quick. Can you see this?
Yes.
All right. Great. Well, hello everyone. My name is Mauricio Herrera. I am a product manager and designer at Environmental Science Associates, ESA. For the last couple of weeks, we've been working with TVEP to basically come up with a plan and a new way of handling the information of this action plan database that you currently have, right? So I have it on the screen right here on the left side, just so that, you know, if you're familiar with it, that this is basically what we're trying to upgrade and enhance. So for the last couple of weeks, I've been working with Maya, Marcus, and some other members of the, partners to kind of get some feedback on what's not working great and come up with a plan on enhancing it. So that's what this is. I'll just kind of make it very brief. The basic bottom line here is that the current system is not great to navigate. It's kind of hard to get information in and out of it. So we're trying to make that whole experience better, not just for the managers of the system like Maya, but also for everyone that has to actually submit information to it and to find information from, future enhancement projects. So here's our final outcome and recommendation after a couple of weeks of analysis and interviews and things like that. One of the main things is that the TVEP already is using a system called Smartsheets to kind of keep track of other projects that are not necessarily the nitrogen load reduction projects. So we are going to move to use Smartsheets as well for the nitrogen reduction projects as well. What that means is that we are going to basically just kind of create all the database and all the tables and all that stuff in that system and provide a page with all the resources, like whatever, all the projects that are active right now that haven't been completed yet, or that are like planned for future implementation, and the form itself, and anything like, how do I know what my WIBIT number is, or do I know what, I need help figuring out my nitrogen estimation reduction because maybe it's a non-point source and I need some help kind of coming up with a number. So all of this will be part of a single page where all of it is integrated. So that way, from your point of view, someone that has to go in here and like input information, you just have one-stop shop to kind of get everything out. And from a point of view of the Tampa Bay estuary program, is they're already using the system that they're already using. They don't have to pay for anything new. And it's all in one place as well, right? So that's the basic kind of final outcome recommendation here. Very, very quick. So if you want me to elaborate anything else, let me know, but that's my update here.
So as Mauricio is building this new enhanced action plan database, we will be rolling out. Several folks have volunteered as beta testers, but hopefully this is a lot more straightforward and removes some of the barriers for you all to continue to report progress on those load reduction projects. So hopefully this makes it easier, and it's an easier way to tell the story of all the work that you're doing as well. So.
For additional background, this is the vehicle we use to show and demonstrate that individual entities are meeting allocations when you are not in compliance with an allocation in future RA compliance cycle. So any additional projects that are input in the action plan database serve as a credit for meeting your allocation if the observed loads for your particular entity are not met in the future. And that's part of the RA process and documentation that we provide to be if that case occurs in future years.
So we have to be out of this room. So does Ray, do you want to make a call for loading information? I know.
Request, one source information on some kind of voting as teams, and I've sent requests out to, everyone. I've gotten more than half responses for both domestic and industrial point sources, but I will be bugging people again. If you've gotten an email from me and you're working on it and you haven't let me know, please let me know so I won't bother you, but,
Yeah, our goal is to generate these loading estimates on an annual basis going forward, rather than waiting to the 5-year period, so we're better able to track. So help Ray out, man. All right, is there anything else for the good of the group? I think we've got a path forward. I appreciate you all sharing your perspectives and advancing this work. I know these are hard decisions before us, but I believe in us.